Welcome to the Family Capital Podcast. My name is Jared Machen. I'm a certified financial planner and a partner at Brownlee Wealth Management. And I also have my co-host here, Justin Brownlee, who is the founder of Brownlee Wealth Management. And Justin, I'm not going to lie, I almost slipped up doing this introduction because we are 130 episodes into another podcast called Financial Planning for Oil and Gas Professionals. But in this episode, I want to talk about this new podcast we have. I want to talk about why we decided to start another podcast, talk about our stories and what we hope to be true of this conversation. But Justin, we're 130 episodes into a podcast called FPONG. Why start another podcast?
I think that in this podcast, we want to address some different things. And so, in the original podcast that we're 130 episodes in, we wanted to spend a lot of the time just looking at technical financial planning details that are relevant to you if you're working in energy. With this podcast, I think we want to just zoom out a little bit and talk more about, are you inheriting wealth? Are you wanting your kids to inherit some of your wealth? Are you thinking about anything pertaining to a family office, whether it's your own, whether you're considering establishing one or you're working at one? And so we wanted this podcast to really just look at how do you think about money across multiple generations with your family? And so I think this is going to allow us to explore a lot of different avenues. I think we will spend some of the time talking about some detailed wealth management ideas that are pertinent to passing down assets. I think there's also, this arena where not every financial conversation with family capital needs to be around financial assets, but we can also talk about relational assets, intellectual assets, spiritual assets. And so I think this podcast is going to help us be able to dive into some of the conversations that we really haven't been able to in our first podcast. And, I think part of how we got here is just the firm that we've been owning and operating for the last 7 or 8 years has put us in this space. And so I'm excited to dive into some of these conversations. But what else? What would you say, Jared? What are you excited to talk about with this?
Yeah. So, it's funny because financial planning, wealth management, there's the same ingredients, right? There's estate planning, there's tax planning, there's insurance planning, there's retirement planning, right? There's charitable planning, right? The ingredients are all the same, but the applications can be very different, right? Depending on what you're solving for. And, we built this business, our core business was built around serving the energy professional, right? And it skewed a lot of millionaires next door just living in the suburbs of large Texas towns and have just had great careers and have complicated benefits. And we've kind of helped them optimize that. One of the distinctives of our wealth management firm was that we had a fixed fee model, right? And one of the benefits of that is, right, instead of fixating on asset gathering and increasing my asset under management fees or trying to increase my piece of the pie, we charge an annual retainer. And the benefit of that is we're fixated on balance sheet optimization, not necessarily trying to grow our market share. And the interesting thing, the unintended consequence of that fee schedule is we start to get approached by families with larger assets, with multi-general estate planning and saying, hey, I like this value proposition. I like this fee schedule. I want somebody to kind of objectively look at everything I have going on. And so, the unintended consequence of setting out this fee schedule that was pretty different from what the industry offered created some interest in a higher demographic than we initially set out to. And we've, one of my roles at Brownlee Wealth Management, I'm chief operating officer, but I also manage several households that we have that have taxable estates. So as we've kind of grown and developed this book of our business, we thought, hey, let's compress, let's share our learnings and develop a podcast unique to those opportunities. Because, when assets pass a certain number, the conversation is no longer, do I have enough to retire? But no, how do I optimize a multi-generational legacy plan? And so I think just having this space to kind of focus on the families with taxable estates or thinking through the mechanics of internal family governance or how to optimize a balance sheet to last tens of generations, it's just a different conversation. So creating a space for that, I think, is really exciting and helps us kind of continue to structure our conversations helpfully across both of our podcasts.
I think that's really important context. When I think about the work that that we've undertaken and what we've built, two things come to mind. And so at its core, we wanted to just be excellent financial planners. We wanted to dive into the weeds of detailed tax planning, estate planning, cash flow analysis, certainly portfolio management, and asset protection. And so really all of the blocking and tackling of a great financial plan, that's what we were obsessed with, and continue to be obsessed with. Now, you hit on a very critical point, Jared. I don't think I'm exaggerating when I say this. Well over 95% of wealth management firms or financial advisors in general, they charge a percentage of asset fee. We were pioneers in this fixed fee movement from day one. So we were one of the early firms in the country to adopt a fixed fee schedule instead of a percentage of asset fee. And just like Jared mentioned, that really attracted families with taxable estates. And so it attracted families who were trying to ask the question, hey, I need to plan for multiple generations. And how do I do that in the best way possible? And certainly having a fee structure that does not incentivize just keeping and hoarding as many assets on the investment platform as possible, that was an integral part of really providing excellent service to families with taxable estates. And so, I think the purpose of this podcast is we want to kind of dive more into that audience. Now, that could be, it could be a lot of different people, but it could be, those looking at the family office space. It could also just simply be anyone who's wanting to pass down any amount of money in a thoughtful way to their children. And it could also be the flip side, those who are inheriting and they want to do it well. But Jared, what would you say are kind of intended audience? Like, who is this podcast for?
Yeah, I would say really it's anybody thinking about multi-generational planning, right? Hey, the question is no longer, do I have enough, but how do I have a legacy that endures, right? And again, like I think you touched on it and it's really important. Like, I think the impetus for this podcast was the fact that 90%, and again, you can debate this, but the general consensus is 90% of wealth is lost by the third generation, right? And I think part of the reason this podcast exists to explore why that is, but I also think it's because there's a one-dimensional view of wealth, right? I think everybody fixates on the numbers, and a lot of our clients are engineers because oil and gas skews engineer, so we love getting in the weeds and talking technical. But also, like in this podcast, I want to take a step back and talk about legacy and more difficult conversations of how do I translate my values to the next generation? How do I set up internal family governance to support spending and to support entrepreneurship and promote the right behavior in next generation, right? I think like our intended audience is anybody who's thinking about enduring and having a legacy that endures and knows that, it's kind of an uphill battle. And I think it's the best way to prepare is to be curious and to also understand and really take a holistic inventory of everything that I have, right? I think if you go to meet with a financial planner, they're going to ask for financial stuff. And that's a very small piece of the equation when you think about something as big and existential as building an enduring legacy. So we'll talk about kind of technical planning strategy because we're planners by trade, but we also want to tell stories, have roundtables with experts, sit in with people who know, have lived, and walk side of families who have done it well. Because this is the math changes and the calculus changes when you're thinking in centuries and not decades.
Right. That's very well put. I think if I was to think about the potential audience for this podcast, three different segments or groups of people come to mind, and we may have touched on these, but number one is whether you're wanting to, maybe you're excited about passing down wealth, or you've just reached a net worth that at the end of the day, your kids are probably going to inherit some material assets. And so I think the first group of people is you are passing down money to your children and or grandchildren, and you want to know, how do I do this in the most thoughtful way possible? How do I do this to where it's a blessing and not a burden? So that's number one, you're passing down wealth. Second segment is you are going to be inheriting money. So you're on the other end of that equation, and you are going to be receiving assets from parents or grandparents, and you're wanting to know, how do I do this well? What are the most important considerations that I should tackle first, second, and third? You're inheriting money. What are you allowed to buy? what is reasonable, what is unreasonable. Jared, you mentioned that kind of famous quote, short sleeves to short sleeves within 3 generations. So this idea that money typically dries up, it typically does not continue to compound into generations 3, 4, and 5. It's typically lost by the 3rd generation. So if you're in that second group where you're trying to inherit money well, how do you kind of buck the trend and make sure that you inherit and you take hold and you steward assets in such a way that, potentially there's more for the next generation than there was for you, if that's your goal. And then the third group of people is you're in the family office world. So maybe you are running your own family office, and maybe you have been for a long time. Maybe you are considering establishing a family office. Something that really blows us away, when we look at the family office space is if you were to look at 100 different family offices, you're probably going to find 80 to 100 pretty different structures, setups, processes, staffs. There's just not a perfect textbook in the family office space that says this is how you should do it. And frankly, I think we're both pretty amazed that a lot of family offices that we look at, we would probably change a ton about what they're doing. And so, I think that's the third intended audience. And we want to dive into that space. And you might be listening to this thinking, hey, that's great. That's exactly what I want. Or you might be thinking, well, I don't have $800 million, so I'm not going to personally set up a family office. But I think those first 2 segments are still very relevant. If you're going to pass down any amount of money to your children, or you're going to inherit any amount of money, we want to talk about how to do that well.
Yeah. And also pass down values, right? One of the reasons we named this podcast Family Capital is financial capital is just one piece of that puzzle, right? We've talked about it, but there's social capital, there's spiritual capital, there's relational capital, right? There's so many different ways that you can think about the idea of legacy, right? And optimizing all of those forms of capital versus having a one-dimensional view. Because our industry is so fixated on the numbers, and then the numbers are just a small piece of it. Justin, I want to kind of take a step back, and I'd love for you to just tell your story, right? And like, how did you kind of stumble into this, and why are you someone worth listening to in regards to conversations about this?
Yeah, I think about the key parts of my story. Right now today, it's kind of fun to be in a place where you and I and 2 other partners are running this business, and I think we're having a lot of fun and it's going well. And I'm married to my wife Lauren. We have 3 kids, and so I think there's a lot of aspects where the conversation that we can have today is super fun, but the journey here was pretty rocky and pretty wild. And so, my origin story is I've been in financial planning for a little over a decade, and I've now been a CFP for, about a decade. And so prior to starting Brownlee Wealth Management, I was at a large brokerage institution. So I was a lead advisor, a director at Fidelity. And, I noticed that a lot of the clients that I saw had really similar situations. And so it was in the Houston area. And so because Houston is truly the center of oil and gas, the vast majority of clients that I was working with, they came from oil and gas. And so at some point, this is about 3 years in to being a director at Fidelity, I told my wife, hey, I really think that I could quit my job, and I really think that I could just start blogging. And I could write really specific blog articles that dive into the weeds of, hey, if you're at a particular level in an oil and gas company and you have these benefits, well, these are the tax and estate planning implications that you need to think through. And so I just started writing on these topics. Now, as life would have it, it was not a linear path. So right after we had our 3rd child, I had a very unexpected cancer diagnosis and a pretty brutal battle with cancer. And so that delayed leaving the firm, that delayed starting my own firm by a little bit. But as God's grace would have it, we were able to start the firm. Gosh, Jared, we're kind of at the beginning of year 8 now. And then within, 10 months of starting the firm, partnered with you. And so, in a real sense, Jared and I founded this firm and built this firm over the past 7 years. And I think it's just been really fun to be able to, like we said, engage in really detailed financial planning. And really get into the weeds of great planning, but then also begin to think through these issues. And it's been fun to have families trust us with their wealth, with their assets, and with giving advice and speaking into this area of, one, how do I inherit assets well? Two, how do I pass down assets well? How do I make sure that my kids are set up to succeed? And what things can I do on a daily, quarterly, annual basis to make sure that my family is moving in the right direction? And so, I think it's been really fun to ask these questions, to begin to answer some of these questions. And, I really hope to use this podcast as a place for Jared, you and I, to share a lot about what we've learned. But also, I want us to be able to have incredible experts that we interview to weigh in on these things. And so I want to have incredible estate planning attorneys and, every facet of maybe people who are in the family office space, who are managing multiple properties or just managing all sorts of different assets. I think we want this to be kind of a collective source of wisdom on the idea of family capital. But yeah, that's a little bit about where we're coming from.
Yeah, I love it. Right. Like, I think that was important, kind of how you closed it, talking about the idea of learning in public. Right. I've been in wealth management my entire professional career, helped lots of families with lots of money, but like, we don't know everything. And this is really an exploration on us building on that. Right. And it's funny because, like, in my case, the reason I got into wealth management actually had nothing to do with wealth management. I liked the idea of, it was one guy who owned a firm, and he hired me and said, "Hey, most financial services jobs out of school, they make you sell." He said, "Hey, I'm not going to make you sell. I just want you to serve." And it was just him and me. And so I figured, hey, this is a front row seat to entrepreneurship. And like every millennial, I wanted to be an entrepreneur, and I figured this was the best way to learn. And as I got into wealth management, I learned I love it. Right? You talked about this idea of families entrusting us. We have reverence for that idea. Like, that's so powerful that somebody takes their all of their work and effort and labor that they've translated to financial capital and entrust you to guide them, right, into deploying it in ways that are consistent with who they want to be and what legacy they want to leave. Like, that's such a powerful thing. Also, like, it's a puzzle. The moment you get your arms around it, tax law changes, estate planning laws change, financial markets change, new asset classes are introduced, right? Like this is a space to be if you're a lifelong learner, right? So, like, this combination of deeply meaningful work and deeply intellectually stimulating work, I got in the industry and I was hooked. And I'm really excited about this podcast because, I've worked with lots of families and, generation 1, generation 2, generation 3. And one of the things that I've noticed is there's just a big void, right? There's a lack of, like, really clear conversation, handoff, expectation setting, vision casting, coordination amongst the generations, right? Well, I think the most common thing I've seen is generation 1 is kind of doesn't want the money to be a burden to generation 2 and 3. So they're not very forthcoming. And so generation 2 and 3 will enter the conversation or, look under the hood and realize what's at stake. And they had no idea, right? And one of two things often happens. They see that amount of money and they get paralyzed because there's no conversation about what I was supposed to do with it. So they just kind of keep existing as though it didn't exist. Or, they send it because it wasn't there and now it's there. And there might be feelings of animosity or, hey, why didn't I was struggling 10 years ago. Why didn't you give me this? So, I've seen a lot of what I would say fumbled handoffs, right, in terms of passing money between the generations. So I'm really excited, like you said, Justin, to bring in experts to kind of suss out, hey, how do we think about the dimensions of capital that my family has? And how do I pass those down so that my family endures? And that the legacy endures and the assets endures and the vision endures, right? So I think it's going to be a really, really fun conversation. Justin, you talked about it a little bit, but is there anything, in terms of format that our listeners should know about? In terms of what to expect with these Family Capital podcast episodes?
I think my ideal scenario is we have, let's say 50% of the episodes are us talking about a specific idea. and kind of diving into the weeds of maybe it's a technical idea of, hey, you own multiple properties and how should this be structured? What entity should own it? What are the potential tax implications? What's the best way to go about it? And then I want another 50% of the episodes to be an interview with someone who's an expert in some of these areas. And again, it could be anything from a tax expert on, multi-generational planning to someone talking about the idea of here's how I'm going about passing down financial wisdom to my children as I also give them assets. And so I think my ideal is that we hit a little bit of a 50-50 mix on we are addressing and talking into the details of specific issues. And then the other 50% are bringing on guests to talk about the same issues. Jared, what do you see? What do you think this should look like?
Yeah, I agree. I totally believe technical experts talking about topics that these families are thinking about is really valuable. I also want this podcast. I want this podcast to tell stories, right? Because I think stories are powerful and it crystallizes things, right? I think about the Waltons, and I think about their, in terms of owning a company and enduring, like Sam Walton, like his footprint, his ethos of how he lived, like everyone knows that, even third parties know that, and so. Right. I think there's clarity of who Sam was, how he set up his estate, and what he hoped was true in light of who he was. Right. And so I want to highlight stories to the extent we can of public facing figures, but also people that, we meet who are kind of walking this and are happy to kind of cross pollinate and share their ideas. But yeah, I mean, I don't want this just to be, talking about the money. And again, I do want to cover that, but I also want to cover the stories. Because I think the vision casting and understanding the who, and that's what animates and activates an audience and really helps crystallize and conceptualize, how these things work out in practice. Because, you talked about it, Justin. If you get 80, if you sit down with 80 family offices, you're going to see 80 different structures, right? There is no playbook, but all of these playbooks can teach you something about you. And so I think, balancing those ideas of, hey, professionals talking about technical problems, but also people with just captivating stories, because the people who built enduring legacies have stories that are captivating and compelling. So figuring out why and how is going to be a lot of fun.
Absolutely. Well, I'm so excited to dive into this, and I think this is going to be an amazing platform to have these conversations.
We're going to have links to subscribe, like, share, post. We look forward to you following us along on this journey. Thanks. See you next time.
This podcast is for informational purposes only. Nothing discussed during this show or episode should be viewed as investment, legal, and tax advice. If you have any questions pertaining to your specific situation, please consult the appropriate qualified professional.